Hi, I'm John Forde. Coming up next on the St. Paul Forum, I'll be speaking with Christopher Mitchell, Director of the Telecommunications as Commons Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. With me today is Christopher Mitchell, Director of the Telecommunications as Commons Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, John.
So the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, that's a cool sounding name. But before we even get to that, tell us who you are and how you got here.
So I'm Chris Mitchell.
Okay.
We got that part covered.
All right.
And I came to St. Paul through Macalester College. And actually, I find it interesting. I'm an East Coaster by birth. I moved here when I was about 14 to Rochester, Minnesota with my family. So I have the benefits of growing up in a very fast-paced, in-your-face culture, and then coming to Minnesota, which I find much more to my style, and it's much nicer.
Okay, good. Can you naturally outsprint all the locals then? Just
Oh, I feel like in meetings I'm at an advantage because I can be very friendly. I've learned that 20 years of living here. However, I can also be very much in your face when we need to get things done, and I need to be very serious. And if I need to tell someone something unpleasant, I don't like it, but I can do it.
But yeah, it comes with the territory. And was your family then in medicine, or were they in like?
No, we were in. I was raised with my mom's a nurse. She's now at the Mayo Clinic, but we came out here for IBM, the I've been moved strategy.
Sure.
My dad went back to college when I was in middle school and ended up getting a job. There were none of those in the Lehigh Valley. We're victims of sort of the Allentown area, and we moved out here and never looked back, basically.
Okay. And you went to Macalester, and you got out of there with that typical do-gooder impulse?
Yeah, I think so. I think I went into it with that do-gooder impulse. I had some really good teachers in high school that nurtured that. I really enjoyed Macalester. I liked the people that I met there. And I came out not really knowing what I wanted to do, but knowing that I was more interested in trying to make things better than I was in just trying to make a good living. You know, I wanted to pay off my student loans, which I think I will at some point, in some distant point in the future. But I really wanted to do things that I thought were worthwhile and I'd look back on and be proud of.
And you're married to a hairstylist? No, we were talking about your hair.
No, my wife works for the state now.
Okay.
We met at the Humphrey Institute, now the Humphrey School
But she
at the
likes your hair
University of
messy.
Minnesota. She does. She absolutely prefers it when it gets a little curly, when it's pretty wet out, when it's humid. My hair gets really curly.
Evidence of productivity or something?
No, I think I don't know what it comes from, but you know, as long as she likes anything about me, I'll take that.
Okay. And then you made a stop at the Humphrey Institute.
Right.
Okay. What was that like?
Well, and actually, it was sort of interesting. I worked at Half Price Books in St. Paul for 4 or 5 years, and I loved it. And a lot of Mac grads there, and I probably would have stayed there forever if I had the opportunity, because of just all these great books coming through, good customers. But I felt like I was not accomplishing much there, and I ran into an old professor who basically said, you should go to grad school. And my sister at that time decided to move back to the Twin Cities. So I didn't want to leave and go to some other distant grad school. I wanted to stick around. And the Humphrey School is really good, and so I applied, and I had a just wonderful professor. It was our first year there, and I understand that she assigns half the workload that she did for our first year, and is still accused of being just crazy in terms of how heavy it is. So I had the benefits then of my advisor just being a workaholic and really putting us through the paces. So I met more great people there, and I really learned a lot at 100 miles an hour.
And then it was on to the Institute for Local Self-Reliance.
Yeah, literally days before I graduated from the Humphrey School, this position opened up. They were looking for someone that had a background in technology, and I'd long been programming and doing server administration and that sort of thing on my own time. I have my own company that was sort of doing web design and then also sports photography. And so I have this technical background, I had a policy degree, and I had a willingness to work at a nonprofit salary. And so I like
trifecta.
I like to say the Venn diagram of all those things was me in the Midwest.
Nice, nice. And you've been with them now for like 7 years?
Yep,
Okay.
7 years.
And they're just turning 40. Was it, you say this month? Or?
Yeah, 5 days ago as we're recording, May 1st.
Okay, all right. And so you came in when they were 33.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. And what have you learned there in the last 7 years?
Well, I've learned a lot. One of the things that I think I first learned is something that I really appreciate, which is that we believe in local self-reliance, the idea that you should make the most of your resources, but we also believe in reality. And so where it's not possible, where it might be more difficult to use your local resources, we're not wed to that. It's you know, the old claim, it's not a suicide pact. We are very interested in things that work. So some people think of us as a think tank, but I think of us more as a group that's both engaged in the thinking process, but also seeing how things play out on the ground so that we can actually come up with policies that work and we can see how they're enacted you know, in the actual cities and the counties that are embracing them.
So it's actually implementing them as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So we have different programs. Some of our programs do nothing but implementing, and that's in our work with composting programs and things like that. They do some higher level policy, but really they're focused on helping communities implement these kinds of programs. My work sort of is all over the place. I see myself as a utility player in the field of internet, where I step up and do what we need to do to move the idea forward of having networks that are responsive to local needs, as opposed to owned by giant companies headquartered out of New York City or something like that.
The general concept of self-reliance, is it almost a dig at like absentee rentiers, that people, you know, people who are just collecting a toll on our businesses, that we're kind of voluntary slaves to them?
It is that. I think that's the first thing you might think of. But the larger sense, I think, is to dig at all of the nature that we may have to just simply take the easy route. And so the first thing is to say, yes, we should not be dependent on these distant companies, whether it's Standard Oil or, you know, any other company that has this massive power and ends up controlling the fate of communities, like the railroad companies did, and like I would say the cable companies do now throughout the United States. But the larger issue is getting people to embrace that at the local level. It's not just all flowers and sunshine, self-reliance. It's hard work, it's responsibility. It's when things go wrong, it's on you to fix them.
It seems like one of the most convenient and tangible applications of local self-reliance would be the food system.
I think so, and that was one of the issues that we started with, and one of the issues we're working on heavily now is actually the end of the food system, in the sense that the tail end of it, which is what we do with the food we don't eat, the scraps, and composting. Rather than throwing them away and landfilling them, you know, you recycle them effectively, you turn it into good dirt, and that's used to grow new food. And you can keep the compost local and encourage new local gardens and that sort of thing. But I think food is a very big deal. I think the issue that you might look at is basically, where does a community spend its resources? You know, what are we spending money on? And a lot of that's going to be food. It's going to be basic utilities. So we want to figure out how to keep that money in the community rather than sending it to California or Texas or something like that.
How much is possible to do in a densely settled urban area?
Oh, there's a lot of things that can be done, and I don't know that we have any model community that's doing all of them, but we look around at a lot of different communities around the country, well, around the planet even, that are doing them. And so, for instance, one of the things that's most amazing about St. Paul, from our perspective, is this district heating system in downtown area, which we had a role in helping to create. And you may not know it, but if a tree falls within 90 miles of the Twin Cities metro area, it basically gets collected, chopped into little tiny pieces, and burned to create both electricity and then heat for combined heat and power to to heat the downtown, to create electricity that's used downtown. And over the past, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years, I don't know when they implemented it, but actually the cooling. If you build a new building in downtown St. Paul, you don't have to put in a furnace, you don't have to put in air conditioners. You hook into this centralized system that's been created that supplies you with these things. It's cost effective, and it uses far less energy than you might otherwise use if you didn't have that system.
How big is it? I mean, is it just the downtown hub, or does it kind of even go a little bit beyond that?
It does go a little bit beyond it. It could go a lot further beyond it, but we haven't expanded it. We had the opportunity when we were building the LRT line, the blue line, is it, I think now?
The green line.
Is it the green line?
Yeah.
Right, the blue line is Hiawatha. Yeah. So the green line, the university line, when we tore that up, there was an opportunity to expand the heating and cooling, but we chose not to do it. It was too expensive at the time.
Yeah, okay. And we'll probably regret it later. It's one of those many, you know.
Right, it's too expensive in the short term. Over the long term, it costs a lot more to have not done it.
Yeah, okay. So tell me about transportation. Is ILSR focused on some of that as far as
We're-
SelfReliance goes?
I'd say we're all interested in it. We don't have a program that focuses on it. So it's our interests or focuses really tend to be along energy issues and more of the electricity that we use in our homes. Then we work on local business issues, waste issues in terms of solid waste and composting, as we already talked. And then I work on the internet issues the most.
Well, that's your focus. So tell me about the internet issues. What's top of mind for you when you say the internet issues?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about. You know, in a city like St. Paul, most of us have good access to the internet. If you can afford it, you have one of the better cable systems that's available in the United States. If you're in a rural area and out in the larger Minnesota region, then you're probably not having very good access. And so in a rural area, the issue is just making sure that everyone can connect and afford it. In an area like St. Paul, it's again making sure everyone can connect, but it's not because the infrastructure's not touching your house, it's an issue of affordability. And then the next step is to say, do we have what we need today? Do we have what we need tomorrow? And I would argue that St. Paul is starting to fall behind because we're relying on a cable system, whereas many other cities are building these fiber optic systems, or they have plans in place to encourage these new fiber optic systems which enable almost limitless speeds.
Now, Minneapolis has citywide Wi-Fi, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, and how is that different from, it's quite different.
Oh, yes.
And how much of a political fight was that to get it done?
It was a big political fight, and that was around the time we started the program on telecom, basically. I mean, a lot of the Institute is now located in Minneapolis, although it came to Minnesota to work with Mayor Latimer, and I live in St. Paul, and when we moved our offices 2 years ago, I really pushed to try and get it in St. Paul, but I didn't succeed. So almost everyone that works for the office is in Minneapolis and was following this quite closely and was concerned that the plan was not a good one, frankly. Minneapolis was going for a plan where it would subsidize for 10 years a private company, a local company that's quite good, has a good reputation for customer service, but would subsidize that company to build and operate the wireless network, and that's what happened. Now, wireless networks in general were way overestimated as to what they could provide back in that time. And so you found that the privately owned networks, the publicly owned networks, all of them underperformed. People who are in Minneapolis, for the most part, find that the wireless network is affordable and almost unusable during peak times because of congestion.
In case you're just joining us, this is the St. Paul Forum, and I'm John Forde. With us today is Christopher Mitchell, Director of the Telecommunications as Commons Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. So Chris, are there cities that have bonded together and been able to do it more successfully than Minneapolis?
Yes. So I would have said that the better solution is one of fiber optic cables. Now, the difference between a wireless approach and a fiber optic approach is basically that Wi-Fi looks much cheaper over the short term, provides you with slower speeds, but you can get it done in an electoral cycle. So a person running for city council, running for mayor can say, I was going to do this, we did it, it's delivering. If you're going to build a fiber optic system, it costs more and it takes longer, and so you have to run for re-election before the benefits start to accrue. That's the biggest problem of fiber optics and why we don't really see them being invested in. But there's a number of cities around the U.S. that have been building them almost always to encourage jobs, to both enhance local opportunities in terms of existing employers to make them more competitive, but then also to bring in new competitors, new companies that are going to say, I can be more competitive if I move my business to Chattanooga than to some other city that doesn't have good access. And Chattanooga is probably the best place in the United States to get internet access today. I'm not. I visited it twice. I met people who went to Chattanooga and they said, I had to choose. This is a 22-year-old kid out of college. I have a great idea for starting the new great internet app, and I have to choose between moving to Silicon Valley and Chattanooga. And Chattanooga has better internet access.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I mean, as soon as you said the word, the song started playing in my head.
Yes,
you know?
yep. No, and the funny thing is Chattanooga has so many things going for it in terms of one of the reasons they've built this incredible system is not just that they just happen to be a place that just decided to do it. They've had this incredible revitalization. They tell this great story of how they've gone into doing it. And it started in 1969 with Walter Cronkite saying it was basically the worst place in America. And so they've been building up, and they've developed this plan, and they built the best internet network available in the United States. And on top of that, they've done all these other things in terms of walkability, and they have great access to mountains and biking and rock climbing and swimming and all this stuff. So it's an interesting up-and-coming place.
Okay. Now, I mean this question both metaphorically and literally, but what can we steal from Chattanooga?
Well, I think a long-term vision, and this is something that I often see. You know, I don't have as much background in St. Paul as many other people that I really respect, and I want to have that background. So I'm active in the e-democracy list where we talk about St. Paul policy issues. And there's a real sense that there is no long-term vision in St. Paul. And I think Minneapolis has maybe a little bit more of that, but I work with elected officials and mayors from cities of all sizes around the United States. I mean, I was actually lucky enough to speak with the top broadband advisor for Mayor de Blasio in New York City. And in every case, I find people working for these local governments that are saying, we recognize that we need something better to be taking advantage of technological changes. I don't see that anywhere here in Minneapolis or St. Paul, frankly. Minneapolis, I think people are afraid to suggest doing something else because the internet, the wireless network hasn't worked out as it was expected to. And in St. Paul, we have some other issues where the Comcast is very powerful here, and all the cable companies in the state want to make sure that the capital city of Minnesota doesn't do something that would look bad for their industry, you know, in terms of showing them up with new investment.
Okay. And you know, so few people really understand the technical of it, but you've been talking about getting fiber direct to the house, is that correct?
Right.
Okay. But as far as I understand it, fiber is essentially infinite, and if it comes within like 300 feet of your house, is there an advantage to going that last 300 feet?
Yes. So the problem is that the last 300 feet then become the bottleneck, and you can't take advantage of that. So and this is perfectly illustrated, I think, in a satirist from Australia, where they're having this very debate over how far to extend the fiber for their national broadband plan. And it's akin to basically having a train drop you off a mile from your house and then walking from there. At that point, it doesn't really matter how fast the train is to get you places. You think about that 1 mile walk. That's where you slow down and you lose a lot of time.
But is it the slowdown, or is it the fact that walk is a tollway? I mean, if it was free, if you could turn up more speed over wire, over metal, would that be the problem? Is it really an economic problem, or is it a technical problem?
Oh, there's a lot of problems tied up in it. So there's issues that are involved with federal policy. So federal policy restricts what we can do as a city. So we can't just use that copper that's already there. We'd have to get permission from the telephone company to use it, and they're really not interested in letting other people use it, right? Because that would be competition for them. And it's the same thing with the cable system, where we would have to get permission for them to use that infrastructure, and they're also not interested in sharing it. So the city could build a system that connects everyone. That would be quite expensive. It would probably involve bonding and building a network, and that would take 10, 15, 20 years of debt to pay off. It would likely cash flow over time, but it would be a hard slog, and it would be a big political fight in a time when no one really wants to have that big political fight that's elected into office. But the larger issue, I think, is as this becomes more of a utility, how are we going to make sure that all of the kids can have access to do their schoolwork and that sort of thing? We are totally failing that right now. And the St. Paul Public Schools, same with many other schools, have this issue with the racial achievement gap. And the danger is, because of the correlation between the race and the other demographics in terms of income and that sort of thing, if you give all the kids iPads and you give them all technological tools to make them learn better, the kids that are going to go home to have better internet connections will learn faster. And the divide between the people who are privileged and those who are not will actually get bigger. That's the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. So there's very real problems that we have to wrestle with, and some of them may involve subsidizing the network at some point in order to make sure that everyone has access. But no one wants to have that conversation right now.
How analogous is this to the economics of like pharmaceuticals, where to maximize their revenue, they need to essentially cut off about 20% of the people and not give them access because they're too poor to get the maximum volume under the curve, as the economists say?
It's very similar. When you look at it, there's a one-time cost, right? So if I was going to say to you, John, I've got a billionaire friend who's going to loan us money. We're going to build out this network to connect everyone in St. Paul. It would probably cost in the order of $200 to $300 million. We would build that network out to touch everyone, and our operating costs moving forward would be pretty low. It would be very easy to make that work. The difficulty is paying off that initial investment. And so you see the same thing in pharmaceuticals, where the cost of developing the drug is very high, but the cost of producing the next pill, in terms of actually stamping it out, the physical unit, is very low. So you have this odd situation where if you and I wanted to compete with any existing companies, we would have to invest tons of money, and the operating costs would be quite low over time. So if you have a situation where you'd have foundations or you'd have others that were willing to step up and say, we're going to put in a lot of money in one-time costs so that this network will be here for decades and benefit everyone, you can make that work. But we don't have that situation right now. Nobody wants to kick in $50 million, $100 million. And so if you want to make the network pay for itself without any sort of subsidization, then it gets harder, and you have to charge people more money, and you don't have as many benefits for low-income people.
So local self-reliance is difficult when the cap cost up front is 8-9 figures.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult when people are unwilling to tax themselves for it.
Yeah.
If you and I were to say, we're going to run for mayor, we're going to run for city council on the premise of let's tax ourselves to build a better internet network that will be available to everyone, that would allow multiple providers to compete for services, right? If you could choose between 10 different providers of internet access, this could be the result. And we had to pay, let's say, $20 more in our property taxes per month, and our telecom bills dropped by $20 or $25 per month, it would be a wash. But a lot of people would be really angry about that, and there would be a big fight as to whether or not that was appropriate.
So it's entrenched institutional interests that are providing a great deal of resistance.
I think so, but it's also a resistance that we have to taxing ourselves as a way of doing this. So, if I tell someone, if I tax you $20 to give you $30, and let's not go into whether or not this is hypothetical, let's say that this is reality, what do you say? There's a surprising number of people who say no, because they hate taxes.
Yeah. Okay.
And so there's that issue.
Now, just as far as the infrastructure, would fiber going in, could it be hanging from poles, or does it have to go underground?
Oh, it can hang from poles, yeah. Okay. So you could work with the whoever owns the poles, which is likely Excel Energy or CenturyLink at this point in most places, and you could put it underground. Underground is more expensive, but it's nicer, it's cheaper in the long term over 50 years because you don't have to pay fees to be on the poles. But it also can tear up neighborhoods and that sort of thing, and people don't always like that so much. Okay. So, but let me just say also, we were talking about the issue of the taxes and whatnot. You can also build these networks without taxing people. There's a variety of approaches. I don't want people to think the only way is to tax. So there's a lot of different benefits and a lot of different ways of going about skinning that cat.
Okay. We just dove right into the telecom stuff, and that's always an interesting financial position. But the Institute for Local Self-Reliance also works with like community banking and some of the financial institutions. What's the position with that?
Well, I think we all recognize that having a few massive banks do really stupid things can tank your economy. We saw this with the world in 2008, 2009, and the reality of the situation is a lot of bankers came out looking bad. However, it was community banks that really didn't do much wrong, and community banks were very strong. Sheila Bair's book, she was the head of the FDIC, an incredible regulator, very smart, Republican, very small business oriented, and that sort of thing. And her book lays it all out in great detail, I think. But the community banks have always been incredibly strong in terms of supporting local businesses, making loans to local businesses, and that sort of thing. The big banks see themselves as casinos with a taxpayer backing. And so community banks are one of the things that we want to encourage, particularly in a time when small businesses aren't creating as many jobs as we'd like them to. They say they have trouble getting access to capital. And that's because we're putting so much more of our money in big banks who don't make loans to small local businesses. If you go to Wells Fargo or someone else and you're trying to get a loan for $100,000, $500,000, the big banks are going to laugh at you and say it's not worth our time to do the paperwork. Whereas a community bank is going to say, yeah, we'll make that work.
How do credit unions play into this?
Credit unions are also wonderful, and in many ways, I think they're tremendous. I guess I shouldn't say they're better than. I've always preferred credit unions, but credit unions tend not to do as much in terms of encouraging local businesses. I think, in the sense of they don't make as many of the types of products available for them, the financial products available for them.
They're essentially people-centered businesses,
right? Yeah, okay. And so there's state banks. North Dakota has a state bank, and this is where I'm on a thin branch right here when I get it beyond anything other than just saying state branches. but the state banks do wonderful things, and particularly in rural areas, to make sure that loaning is available and that that the financial system's working for everyone and not just for some people that live in Manhattan.
What is a state bank and how does it work?
I appreciate that. Next question, please.
It's owned by the state.
Yes, it's owned by
Okay.
the state. I just don't have very much expertise in the state banks. My colleague Stacy Mitchell, who we have an office of about 10 people scattered across 3 different locations. Stacy Mitchell and I have a name collision, but no relation. We just have tremendous respect for her. She knows everything about state banks, and so I know nothing about it. I've abandoned SelfReliance in the office, and I rely on her for the knowledge when it comes to the banking issues.
Okay. Chris, we got about 2 minutes left. I just want to hear a little bit more about the Institute itself. It was founded initially by
David Morris. And Neil Seldman in Washington,
Okay.
D.C.
Okay.
So we have an office in D.C. We've never really worked on federal issues. They just happened to live there when they came up with the idea of doing this Institute for Local Self-Reliance.
And it's 40 years old now. And
Yep.
how many people on staff?
We have about 11 or 12 full-time equivalent, and then I think that leaves, it's like 8 or 9 of us doing program work on a regular basis.
Okay. And is it funded largely through philanthropy, or are there other
Mostly
revenue streams?
foundations. We
Okay.
have some contributors that help out, and then we do a fair amount of contract work with our Waste to Wealth and establishing composting programs where local governments may pay them to help set up a program and that sort of thing.
Chris, we got 8 seconds left. What's the website?
The website is muninetworks.org and ilsr.org.
We've been speaking to Christopher Mitchell, Director of the Telecommunications as Commons Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. That's all we have time for. We hope to see you next week on the St. Paul Forum.